Dear listener, close your eyes and imagine England in 1603. The air smells of coal smoke and freshly turned earth, and the streets of London buzz with a strange mix of grief and curiosity. In Richmond Palace, a woman lies dying. Her face is painted white with a paste of lead and vinegar, her red wig askew, but even now, there's a spark in her eyes that once made kings tremble. This is Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, who ruled for 45 years, who defeated the Spanish Armada, who turned a small island into a power to be reckoned with. When she breathes her last on that cold March morning, something breaks. Not just a life, but an age. For the first time in centuries, England's crown will pass to a stranger. James VI of Scotland, now James I of England, crosses the border with a retinue of Scottish lords, his accent thick and foreign to English ears. Imagine being a London shopkeeper, leaning out your window to watch him pass. He looks like a scholar, not a king, you mutter to your neighbor. And it's true, James loves books more than justs, debates more than hunts. But what troubles people most isn't his manners. It's his ideas. James believes kings are chosen by God, answerable only to heaven, not to any bunch of lords or commoners. Kings are justly called gods, he tells Parliament, for they wield a little piece of divine power on earth. To English ears, this sounds wrong. For generations, even queens like Elizabeth had to dance around Parliament, listening to their complaints, trading favors for money. Now, this Scottish king acts as if he can do whatever he wants. In taverns, men grumble over their ale. What's the point of Parliament if the king won't listen? Asks a blacksmith from York. A merchant nods. Elizabeth knew how to play the game. This one? He thinks he's above it all. And so, the first cracks appear. Religion makes things worse. England is a country divided by faith. Most people are Anglicans, following the Church of England with its bishops and prayer books. But there are Puritans, too, strict Protestants who hate fancy rituals, who want to purify the Church of anything that smells like Catholicism. And then there are Catholics, driven underground by laws that fine them for attending Mass, that call their faith treason. Elizabeth balanced these groups like a tightrope walker. James? He's never walked this rope before. Raised a Presbyterian in Scotland, he's crowned in an Anglican ceremony, and he doesn't understand why everyone's so worked up about crosses or kneeling or how long a sermon should be. Can't we all just get along, he seems to say. But for many, faith isn't something to get along about. It's a matter of heaven and hell. Then, in 1605, something terrible happens. Late one night, a man named Guy Fawkes is caught in the cellars beneath Parliament, guarding 36 barrels of gunpowder. His plan? Blow up the king, the lords, the commons, everyone who makes laws that hurt Catholics. The plot is foiled, but the fear it sparks doesn't fade. Suddenly, every Catholic is a suspect. In market squares, effigies of the Pope burn alongside Fawkes. Priests preach that Catholics are secret assassins, waiting for Rome's signal. James himself barely escaped death. But instead of calming things down, the plot makes people angrier. Protestants shout for harsher laws. Catholics whisper that they're being framed. The country feels like a barrel of gunpowder, just waiting for a spark. Here's a question to think about: why did a king's beliefs matter so much? Because in 1600s England, religion and government were tangled up like a ball of yarn. The king was head of the church, so his faith shaped everyone's prayers, their churches, their very idea of right and wrong. If James favored one group over another, people feared their way of life, their souls, were at risk. As James settles into his reign, the cracks widen. He argues with Parliament about money. He spends too much, they say. He argues with Puritans about church rituals, too fancy, they say. He argues with Catholics about their rights, too dangerous, everyone else says. By the time his son Charles takes the throne years later, those cracks will have turned into chasms. But for now, life goes on. Farmers plant their crops, merchants sail to the Indies, children laugh in the streets. It's easy to ignore the tension, to hope that things will get better. But in the quiet moments, in the stillness of a church service, in the hush of Parliament when the king speaks, you can feel it, a storm is coming. Imagine opening your purse to find it empty, except for a few coins and a stack of bills. That's how England's treasury looked when James I settled into the throne. Elizabeth I, for all her glory, had left behind a mountain of debt, thanks to wars and royal splendor. But James? He turned that mountain into a volcano. The new king loved luxury. Silk robes, golden cups, grand parties, he wanted it all. He showered his favorites with gifts, castles, land, titles. One courtier, Robert Carr, went from a nobody to an earl overnight, just because James liked his company. He's spending like a man who thinks gold grows on trees, grumbled a London merchant, counting his coins. And James didn't just waste money on frippery. He dreamed of making England a European power, which meant funding armies and navies, costs that made the treasury groan. To fill the coffers, James did what kings had always done, he called Parliament. But Parliament wasn't just a cash machine. These men, landowners, merchants, lawyers, had their own ideas. They wanted a say in how the money was spent. Show us where the last tax went, they told James, and we'll talk. James hated this. I'm king by God's grace, he fumed. I shouldn't have to beg from a bunch of commoners. For years, the dance went on. James asked for money, Parliament argued, eventually, they'd agree on a small sum, and James would storm off, muttering about insolent subjects. But by 1610, things got ugly. The king needed cash to pay for a war in Europe, so he proposed a great contract. Parliament would give him a big lump sum, and in return, he'd give up some ancient rights to raise money on his own. It could have worked, if James hadn't backed out. I can't give up my prerogatives, he said. Parliament walked out, and the treasury stayed empty. James got desperate. He started selling monopolies, exclusive rights to sell everything from soap to playing cards. A lucky courtier could buy the right to sell wine, then jack up the price, making a fortune while ordinary people paid more. It's robbery, shouted a tavern keeper, wiping mugs. The king's letting his friends pick our pockets. When Parliament protested, James shut them down for years. I'll rule without you, he declared. But even kings can't ignore empty vaults. In 1621, James was forced to recall Parliament. This time, the members were angry. They impeached one of James's favorites, Francis Bacon, for taking bribes. He's a crook, they shouted. Bacon was found guilty, and James, red-faced, had to let him be punished. It was a small victory, but it sent a message: Parliament wouldn't be pushed around. Then there were the forced loans. When James needed money for a war with Spain, he didn't ask Parliament, he demanded that wealthy subjects lend the crown money. Refuse, and you'd be thrown in jail. It's not a loan, muttered a knight from Kent, handing over his silver. It's theft, plain and simple. Men like Thomas Wentworth, who later became a royal advisor, argued that the king had a right to do this in emergencies. But most saw it as tyranny. Here's a question to chew on: why couldn't James just be frugal like Elizabeth? It wasn't just greed. James ruled over a bigger kingdom, England, Scotland, and Ireland, and he wanted to make it strong. But he didn't understand that Elizabeth's frugality was a political skill. She'd charm Parliament, listen to their complaints, and make them feel like partners. James saw them as nuisances. He thought kings should command, not negotiate. And in a country where Parliament had been around for centuries, that was a dangerous mistake. By the time James died in 1625, the damage was done. The treasury was deeper in debt, Parliament was furious, and ordinary people resented the king's greed. His son, Charles, inherited not just a crown, but a powder keg. In taverns, men no longer grumbled quietly. They shouted. No more forced loans. Parliament must have a say. A blacksmith in York summed it up: James talked like a god, but he spent like a fool. Let's hope his son is wiser. But Charles? He was about to prove that some mistakes run in the family. The crowd at Charles I's coronation in 1626. The air hums with anticipation, but there's a flicker of unease. This new king is nothing like his father. James was jolly, a bit messy, always ready to debate. Charles? He's tall, handsome, with a face that looks carved from stone. He speaks slowly, stuttering when he's nervous, but his eyes are sharp, too sharp, some think. He cares about dignity, about ceremony, about making sure everyone knows who's in charge. And that scares people. Charles inherits his father's mess, a treasury empty as a beggar's pocket, a parliament that hates being ignored, and a kingdom split by faith. But instead of mending fences, he tightens his grip. My way or the highway, he seems to say. Let's start with money. Charles needs cash, badly. His wars in Europe, against Spain, then France, cost a fortune, and Parliament refuses to give him enough. Show us you'll listen, they say. Charles snorts. In 1629, after a heated argument about taxes and religion, he storms out of Parliament and locks the doors. I don't need you, he declares. And for the next 11 years, he rules alone. Historians call this the personal rule, but many just call it tyranny. To get money without Parliament, Charles digs up old laws, some dusted off from medieval times. There's ship money, a tax coastal towns paid to fund the navy. Charles expands it to all towns, even those in the middle of England. It's for defense, he says. But farmers in Oxfordshire grumble. Defense from what? We're miles from the sea. Then there are the forest laws. Centuries ago, kings owned vast forests, and anyone who cut wood or hunted there had to pay. Charles decides lots of land that's now farms or villages is still royal forest. He finds landowners left and right. A squire from Warwickshire sighs as he hands over his silver. First he takes our money, then he tells us our fields aren't ours. What's next? But it's religion that really sets people off. Charles loves the Church of England, its beautiful robes, its grand music, its bishops in their fancy hats. He picks William Laud as Archbishop of Canterbury, a man who hates Puritans with a passion. Laud launches his Beauty of Holiness campaign. He orders churches to put back altars, to use fancy prayer books, to make people kneel during services. To Puritans, this smells like Catholicism, the faith they'd fought against for generations. Laud wants to bring back the Pope, shouts a Puritan preacher in a London church. Crowds cheer. Puritans are arrested for refusing to follow the new rules. Their books are burned. Some are even whipped or put in stocks. A minister from Yorkshire writes in his diary, "They call this reform, but it's just tyranny with a cross." Many Puritans decide enough is enough. They pack their bags and sail to America, where they can pray as they please. Good riddance, some in Charles's court say. But others worry, if the king drives out good, hard-working people, who will stay to build the country? Not everyone suffers, of course. Charles showers his favorites with gifts. The Duke of Buckingham, a pretty, smooth-talking man, gets castles, titles, and control of the navy, even though he's a terrible sailor. When Buckingham is assassinated in 1628, Charles weeps like a child. "Now who will stand by me?" he asks. But most people cheer. "One less thief," says a market woman, selling apples. John Hampden, a wealthy landowner, becomes a hero when he refuses to pay ship money. "It's not about the money," he tells his neighbors. "It's about the king thinking he can tax us without asking." His trial in 1637 becomes a national obsession. The judges rule against him, but everyone talks about his courage. "If we let the king do this," Hampden says, "what won't he do next?" Here's a question to toss around: why was Charles so stubborn? He truly believed kings were chosen by God, that questioning his rules was questioning divine will. He saw Parliament as a nuisance, Puritans as troublemakers, and anyone who disagreed as disloyal. But he forgot something important: England wasn't a country where kings could do whatever they wanted. For centuries, people had fought for the right to have a say, to debate, to protest, to make sure no one held too much power. Charles thought he was above all that. And that's a dangerous thought for any ruler. By 1638, the country is a pressure cooker. Farmers grumble about taxes, Puritans whisper about rebellion, and even some lords wonder if the king has lost his mind. But Charles? He's busy making a new mistake, this time, north of the border. Picture this: a cold Sunday morning in Edinburgh, 1637. The air is sharp with frost, and the pews of St. Giles Cathedral are packed. The minister stands to read from a new prayer book, one sent by King Charles, designed to make Scottish churches look and sound like English ones. But when he opens his mouth, chaos erupts. "Popery!" shrieks a woman in the front row, flinging her stool at the pulpit. "This is the work of the devil." The crowd joins in, shouting, hissing, tearing up hymnals. By the end of the service, the streets are filled with people chanting, "No bishops. No English prayers." This is how Scotland's war with Charles I begins, not with cannons, but with a prayer book. You see, Scotland's church was different. They were Presbyterians, no bishops in fancy robes, no altars draped in silk, just plain wooden tables and preachers who shouted about God's wrath. To them, Charles's new prayer book wasn't just a change in liturgy, it was an attack on their identity, their faith, their very way of life. Charles, safe in London, scoffs. "A bunch of peasants throwing stools? I'll teach them respect." He sends soldiers to Scotland, thinking a show of force will quiet things down. But Scotland isn't England. The Scots are tough, proud, and they hate being told what to do, especially by an English king. In 1638, they gather in Greyfriars Kirk in Edinburgh and sign the National Covenant. It's a promise, written in blood and ink, to defend their church against all innovations. Farmers, lords, preachers, even women, they all put their names to it. "We'll die before we let Charles ruin our kirk," says a blacksmith from Glasgow, his hand shaking as he signs. Charles declares the Covenant treason. He raises an army and marches north. But the Scots are ready. They've got their own army, led by Alexander Leslie, a veteran of European wars. At Berwick in 1639, the two sides face off. Charles's soldiers are ill-equipped, poorly trained, and many don't even want to fight. "Why fight Scots for a prayer book?" mutters a young soldier from Yorkshire. The First Bishops' War ends not with a battle, but a whimper. Charles signs a truce, pretending to back down. But everyone knows it's just a pause. He'll be back, Leslie warns his men. And next time, he'll mean business. He's right. Charles spends the next year begging, borrowing, and stealing to raise a bigger army. He even tries to hire soldiers from France and Spain, anything to crush the Scots. In 1640, he marches north again. This time, the Scots don't wait. They cross the border into England, catch Charles's army off guard at Newburn, and chase them all the way to Newcastle. Imagine being a farmer in Durham, watching Scottish soldiers march through your fields. "They're not here to rob us," your neighbor says. "They just want the king to listen." And listen he must. The Scots occupy Newcastle, demand a fortune in compensation, and refuse to leave until Charles calls Parliament to pay them. Charles has no choice. On November 3, 1640, after 11 years of ruling alone, he summons Parliament. It's a desperate move, and he knows it. "These men will tear me apart," he mutters to his advisers. And he's right. This Parliament, later called the Long Parliament, is full of people who've spent a decade fuming about his tyranny. Here's a question to ponder: why did a fight over prayer books turn into a full-blown war? Because it was never just about prayer books. It was about who holds power. Charles thought he could force Scotland to be like England. The Scots thought they should decide their own way of worship. And when Charles used force, they fought back, not just for their church, but for the right to say no to a king who wouldn't listen. As the Long Parliament gathers in Westminster, the air is thick with tension. The Scots are camped just north of the border, Parliament is spoiling for a fight, and Charles is backed into a corner. It's only a matter of time before the spark in Scotland catches fire in England. If you walking into Westminster Hall in November 1640, the air is thick with pipe smoke and tension. Men in fur-trimmed robes crowd the benches, their faces flushed with anger and excitement. This is the Long Parliament, so named because it will sit for years, not months, and from the moment they gather, it's clear they're not here to bow to the king. For 11 years, these men have watched Charles I rule alone, taxing them without permission, jailing critics, and ignoring their rights. Now, they're ready to fight back. "We'll make him pay," whispers John Pym, a sharp-eyed lawyer from Somerset who's spent years plotting against the king's abuses. "Not with gold, but with justice." Their first target? Thomas Wentworth, Earl of Strafford. If Charles was the brains of the tyranny, Strafford was the brawn. A tall, imposing man with a voice like thunder, he'd crushed rebellions in Ireland, bullied Parliament, and once told the king, "You have an army in Ireland that can reduce this kingdom." To Parliament, he was public enemy number one. Treason. Pym shouts, slamming his fist on the table. The hall erupts. MPs take turns listing Strafford's crimes, taxing without consent, killing protesters, plotting to bring Irish soldiers to England to crush dissent. "He's a wolf in sheep's clothing," cries one. "Hang him," yell others. Strafford is locked in the Tower of London, but he's not going down without a fight. At his trial, he defends himself with such skill that even some of his enemies nod in admiration. "I served my king," he roars. Is that a crime? But Pym and his allies aren't playing by the rules. When it looks like Strafford might be acquitted, they switch tactics. They introduce a Bill of Attainder, a law that declares him guilty without a full trial. He's too dangerous to let live, Pym argues. London erupts. Crowds gather outside Parliament, chanting, "Justice for Strafford." But not the kind he wants. Women march with petitions, children shout insults, and a mob even tries to storm the tower. "Hang him," they scream. Charles, watching from Whitehall, panics. He loves Strafford like a brother, but he's scared of the mob. "I can't save him," he mutters, signing the death warrant with a shaking hand. On May 12, 1641, Strafford walks to the scaffold on Tower Hill. The crowd cheers as the axe falls, but some weep. "We've crossed a line," a merchant says, turning away. "If we kill a king's friend, what's next?" But Parliament isn't done. They abolish the Star Chamber, the king's secret court that jailed critics without trial, and the High Commission, which punished Puritans. They pass laws saying Parliament can't be dissolved without its own consent. "We're not just fixing the past," Pym says. "We're building a new England." Yet trouble is brewing. Charles, humiliated by Strafford's death, plots revenge. He secretly promises Irish Catholics he'll lift their restrictions if they rebel, hoping chaos will make Parliament beg for his help. And in Scotland, Presbyterians demand England adopt their church system, which scares English Puritans who want more freedom, not less. Here's a question that hangs in the air: why was Strafford's death such a turning point? It wasn't just about one man. It was Parliament saying, "We're in charge now." For centuries, kings had been untouchable, their friends safe. But by executing Strafford, Parliament proved that even the king's closest allies weren't above the law, their law. It was a revolution, quiet but profound, and it left Charles with only one choice: fight back, or lose everything. As summer turns to autumn, England holds its breath. Parliament thinks it's won. Charles thinks he can still save his crown. But both are wrong. The axe that fell on Strafford's neck wasn't just for him. It was the first blow in a war that would tear England apart. The autumn of 1641 smells like smoke and fear. In Ireland, the countryside is on fire. Catholic peasants, tired of being pushed off their land by English and Scottish settlers, have risen up. They storm castles, burn farms, and drive the settlers out, sometimes violently. News reaches London in tattered letters, each more terrifying than the last. "They're killing every Protestant they find," a merchant cries, slamming his fist on a tavern table. "Babies, women, everyone." No one knows who to blame, but fingers point at Charles. Rumors spread that he secretly encouraged the rebels, hoping chaos would make Parliament weak. "He'd rather see Ireland burn than share power," whispers a Puritan minister. Charles swears it's not true, but few believe him. He'd already tried to help Irish Catholics before, why stop now? Parliament panics. They need an army to crush the rebellion, but who will lead it? If Charles controls the army, he might march it on London. If Parliament controls it, Charles will call it treason. "We can't trust him," John Pym says, pacing Westminster's halls. "Not after everything." They propose a compromise: Parliament will pick the army's generals, and Charles can be the commander-in-chief, in name only. Charles laughs bitterly. "So you want me to be a king in a cage," he says. I'll die first. He believes God gave him sole power over the military, no one else gets a say. The argument drags on for months. Winter comes, and the Irish rebels keep winning. Settlers flee to England, their clothes ragged, their eyes wild with stories of horror. In London, mobs attack Catholic homes. Hang them all, they shout. Parliament blames Charles for not acting faster. Charles blames Parliament for tying his hands. Then, in January 1642, Charles does something reckless. He hears that 5 MPs, including Pym, are plotting to take over the army. Furious, he grabs 400 soldiers and marches to the House of Commons. "I'm here to arrest traitors," he announces, striding into the chamber. The MPs stare at him, frozen. The Speaker, William Lenthall, drops to his knees. "Sire," he says, "I have no eyes to see or tongue to speak here except as the House directs me. In other words, we answer to Parliament, not you." Charles looks around. The 5 MPs are gone, warned just in time. "I see all the birds have flown," he mutters, storming out. The crowd outside boos. A woman throws a stone, shouting, "Traitor!" Charles flinches. He's never felt so alone. That night, Charles flees London. He heads north, gathering supporters, lords, bishops, and farmers who still believe in kings. Parliament's gone mad, he tells them. They want to destroy everything. Parliament doesn't wait. They vote to raise an army, with the Earl of Essex as their leader. "We're defending England from tyranny," Pym says. By spring, the country is split. Men in Yorkshire argue over which side to join. A blacksmith nails a pro-Parliament sign to his door, his brother, a farmer, tears it down. "The king's our lawful ruler," he growls. "You're just a rebel." In June, Charles raises his standard in Nottingham, a red flag fluttering in the wind. "I fight for your liberties," he declares. But few are sure what that means anymore. Here's a question that burns like the Irish fires: why did an army matter so much? Because it wasn't just about soldiers. It was about who got to decide England's future: Parliament, with its squabbling MPs, or the king, with his divine right. The army was the key to power, and neither side would let go. As summer comes, men pick up swords. Fathers and sons stand on opposite sides. A cobbler from Oxford signs up with Parliament because he hates taxes. A knight from Kent joins the king because he hates Puritans. No one knows how long it will last. No one knows how many will die. But everyone knows one thing: the fight isn't about Ireland anymore. It's about England's soul. The morning of October 23, 1642, breaks cold and misty over the Warwickshire countryside. The air hums with a strange, tense silence. No birds sing, no wind stirs the leaves. On one side of the valley, 15,000 parliamentarian soldiers huddle around campfires, their breath visible in the chill. On the other, 12,000 royalists stand in neat lines, their armor glinting through the fog. This is it, the first major battle of the English Civil War. Imagine being a farmer from nearby Kyneton, hiding behind a hedge to watch. You recognize faces on both sides. Your cousin, who's always gone on about liberty, is with the Parliament men. Your landlord, who swears by the king, stands with the royalists. What are they fighting for? You whisper to your son. He just shakes his head. No one seems sure anymore. The parliamentarians are led by Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, a tall, grave man in a scarlet coat. He raises his sword. "For God and the laws," he shouts. His men roar back, but their voices waver. Most are farmers and craftsmen, not soldiers. They've never held a pike for more than a few weeks. On the royalist side, Prince Rupert, King Charles's nephew, just 23, leads the cavalry. He's a firebrand, with long hair and a reckless grin. "Charge," he yells, kicking his horse into a gallop. His men follow, their swords flashing. The parliamentarian cavalry, made up of nervous gentlemen, panics. They turn and flee, leaving the infantry exposed. "Run," someone shouts. And for a moment, it looks like the royalists will win. But then, something strange happens. The parliamentarian foot soldiers, farmers, blacksmiths, weavers, stand their ground. "Hold," cries their commander, Sir William Balfour. "For England." They lock their pikes together, forming a forest of steel that the royalist horses can't break through. Now it's the royalists' turn to struggle. Rupert's cavalry, chasing the fleeing parliamentarians, has ridden too far. The royalist infantry, outnumbered, starts to falter. A young parliamentarian soldier from London, his hands shaking, stabs a royalist knight through the throat. "Sorry," he gasps, but the knight is already dead. By afternoon, the valley is a slaughterhouse. Men lie in heaps, their blood soaking the earth. A royalist drummer boy, no older than 12, crawls toward a stream, his leg shattered. A parliamentarian nurse, risking her life, drags him to safety. "Why?" he whimpers. She doesn't have an answer. King Charles, watching from a nearby hill, paces like a caged lion. "Where is Rupert?" he growls. His general, the Earl of Lindsay, tries to rally the men, but a bullet catches him in the chest. He dies in his son's arms, whispering, "Tell the king I tried." As dusk falls, both sides withdraw, too exhausted to fight on. The parliamentarians retreat to Warwick Castle, the royalists limp back to their camp. No one has won. But everyone has lost. Imagine the farmer from Kyneton, walking the battlefield at dawn. He finds his cousin, face down in the mud, a hole in his back. His landlord lies a few yards away, eyes wide, as if still surprised. "This is what they fought for," he says, tears mixing with the rain. In London, news of the battle spreads like wildfire. "We held them," Parliament supporters shout. But in Oxford, where the king has set up court, royalists claim victory. "The rebels are weakened," they say. No one mentions the 2,000 dead, or the families waiting for sons and fathers who'll never come home. Here's a question that hangs over the blood-soaked fields: why did so many die for a battle that decided nothing? Because war isn't just about winning. It's about proving you're willing to bleed for what you believe. The men at Edgehill didn't die for a king or a parliament, they died for an idea, that their way of life was worth fighting for. And once blood is shed for an idea, it's hard to stop. As winter comes, the war spreads. Royalists take control of the north and west, Parliament holds London and the southeast. Villages choose sides, sometimes splitting families. A blacksmith in Yorkshire makes swords for the king, his brother, a tailor, sews uniforms for Parliament. It's not right, their mother says, but no one listens. The Battle of Edgehill was just the first spark. Now the fire is spreading, and soon, there will be no corner of England left untouched. By 1644, England was weary of war. Fields lay untended, villages stood empty, and every churchyard had fresh graves. Parliament's army, once fiery with resolve, stumbled from one defeat to another. Royalist forces, led by Prince Rupert's flamboyant cavalry, seemed unbeatable. A parliamentarian soldier, cleaning his rusted pike, muttered to his comrade that they were losing, wondering who might save them. That someone was Oliver Cromwell, a farmer from Huntingdonshire with a face like weathered oak and a voice that boomed like thunder. He was no nobleman, no trained general, just a Puritan who hated tyranny. "I see a need," he often said, "and I fill it." Cromwell had fought since the war's start, leading a ragtag group known as the Ironsides, soldiers who rode like the wind and fought like demons. What set them apart? They were not just soldiers, they were believers. "We fight for God," Cromwell told them, "not for lords, not for gold. For truth." Each morning, they prayed together, each night, they sang psalms. When they charged, they shouted, "The Lord is with us." But Parliament needed more than a small band of zealots. By 1645, desperation pushed them to radical action, creating a new army. Not a patchwork of local militias, but a single, professional force, paid regularly, trained rigorously, led by men who knew their craft. They called it the New Model Army. Cromwell helped shape it. No more gentlemen with fancy swords but no sense, he insisted. "We need fighters, farmers, blacksmiths, weavers. Men who mean it." He chose officers for skill, not birth. A cobbler skilled with a sword became a captain, a weaver who could rally men became a colonel. "Rank is not born," Cromwell said. "It is earned." A young weaver from Norwich signed up, never having held a musket before. The drill sergeant, an ex-miner with a scar across his cheek, taught him patiently. "Shoulder arms," he barked. The weaver fumbled, but the sergeant only said, "Again." By week's end, he could march in step, fire in formation, and stand firm when cannons roared. "We are not just lads with guns," his captain said. "We are an army." When the New Model Army marched in 1645, the world took notice. They were disciplined, no looting, no drunkenness, no reckless pursuit of enemies like Rupert's men. In camp, they built latrines instead of bonfires. In battle, they held formation even as bullets flew. "They move like a single beast," a royalist spy wrote, trembling. "We cannot outrun them." Their first great test came at Naseby in June 1645. King Charles was there with his best troops, including Rupert's cavalry. "This will end it," the king said, adjusting his crown. But he did not know the New Model Army. Cromwell led the charge. "Hold your fire until you see their eyes," he shouted. Royalists charged, but the New Model soldiers stood fast. Their cannons roared, their muskets cracked. Rupert's men, used to easy wins, faltered. "They will not break." Rupert growled, but he was wrong. By afternoon, Royalists fled. The New Model Army chased them for miles, seizing the king's baggage, papers, even his personal letters, proof he had begged France for help and lied to Parliament about peace. "Treason!" Cromwell roared, waving the letters. "This is why we fight." Naseby was no mere victory, it was a crushing one. The Royalist army was destroyed. Charles fled, his dreams of victory in tatters. A New Model soldier, sitting on a cannon, said they had won. But Cromwell shook his head. "We have started to win," he said. "The real work begins now." In villages, people cheered the New Model Army as heroes. "They are not like other soldiers," a baker said, handing out loaves. "They pay for what they take. They say, 'Please,' and 'Thank you.' But not all loved them. Royalists called them Cromwell's fanatics. They want to turn England into a monastery, a lord grumbled. Here is a question to ponder: what made the new model army so special? Not just better training or fancier weapons, but purpose. These men believed they did God's work, purifying England, ending tyranny, building a nation where everyone mattered, not just kings and lords. They fought for a vision, not a paycheck. And that, more than anything, made them unbeatable. As 1645 turned to 1646, the new model army mopped up the last royalist strongholds. Exeter fell, Oxford surrendered. King Charles, alone and hunted, fled to Scotland, seeking safety. But the Scots handed him over to Parliament. "He is your problem now," they said. The war was all but over. But the new model army did not go home. They had tasted power, seen what they could build. "We did not fight to put another tyrant in charge," Cromwell said. As they camped outside London, waiting, the nation held its breath. What would come next? The winter of 1648 clung to England like a shroud. The Thames froze solid, and the land lay silent under a crust of snow, as if holding its breath. The Second Civil War had sputtered out, leaving royalist resistance in tatters, but no warmth seeped into the chill. The new model army's campfires flickered outside London, their light casting long shadows over soldiers' faces, faces etched with resolve, not relief. Years of war had burned away patience for King Charles I. Months earlier, Charles had gambled on a Scottish invasion to reclaim his throne, and lost. This time, Parliament and the army saw no path forward with him alive. In December 1648, Colonel Thomas Pride led soldiers to seal Westminster Hall, barring MPs who still dreamed of compromise. The rump parliament that remained, lean, radical, unyielding, voted to put the king on trial. In January 1649, Westminster Hall was transformed. The ancient chamber, where kings had been crowned and laws forged, became a courtroom for a king. The High Court of Justice assembled 135 commissioners, MPs, officers, men who believed in Parliament's supremacy. When Charles was led to the dock, he wore a plain black cloak, his posture rigid, his eyes sharp with defiance. No crown, no scepter, just a man, but a man who still thought himself above laws. The trial began with a roar: "Charles Stuart, you stand accused of treason against your people, of waging war, spilling innocent blood, tearing your kingdom apart." Charles stared down the prosecutors. "I do not recognize this court," he said, his voice steady. "A king is appointed by God, answerable only to him. No earthly power can judge me." Days stretched into a battle of wills. Charles refused to plead, calling the proceedings a mockery. The judges fired back: "England's people are sovereign. Kings serve them, not the other way around." Outside, London seethed. Crowds chanted "justice," or crossed themselves, murmuring that killing a king was a sin. A fishwife shouted from the streets, "He's a man, not a god," and was shushed by those who feared divine wrath. On January 27, the verdict fell. Charles Stuart, guilty of high treason. Sentenced to death. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Charles nodded, as if he'd expected nothing less. January 30th dawned bitter cold. A crowd packed the square outside Whitehall, breath frosting in the air. Charles walked from St. James's Palace, calm as if strolling a garden. He stopped to speak to a child, to adjust a shivering soldier's coat. On the scaffold, he removed his cloak to reveal a white shirt. "So you may see I die calmly," he said. To the executioner, he murmured, "Tie back my hair. It might get in the way." He knelt, prayed, and stretched out his hands. The axe fell. A single, guttural groan rose from the crowd, a sound like the earth itself sighing. Some screamed, some wept, some turned and ran. The sun blazed, but no one felt its warmth. A witness wrote later, "That day, England's sky changed. We killed a king, and 1,000 years of tradition with him." Charles's body was buried hastily at Windsor, but his death echoed across Europe. Kings shuddered, calling it regicide, a crime against God. In England, people whispered, uncertain. Had they destroyed a tyrant, or broken a sacred bond? Here is the question that burned in every heart: why did killing a king matter so much? Because it shattered the old order. For centuries, kings had hidden behind divine right, acting as if they were above their people. But Charles's death screamed a new truth: rulers serve the ruled. When they betray that trust, even kings must answer. It was a revolution written in blood, a line in history no one could erase. With the king gone, England stepped into a void. No one knew what came next: a nation without a king, a people who had dared to rewrite the rules. The future loomed, blank and terrifying, as wide as the winter sky over London. The year 1649 dawned on an England unrecognizable to its people. The king was dead, beheaded in the square outside Whitehall, his blood still staining the cobblestones, and in his place, something new, a republic. No more monarchy, no more House of Lords. Just a parliament, now called the Rump, sitting in Westminster, trying to stitch a broken nation back together. London hummed with a strange energy, part excitement, part dread. Merchants whispered in coffeehouses, "Can we really govern ourselves without a king?" Women hung laundry in alleyways, shaking their heads, "God will punish us for killing our sovereign." Soldiers of the new model army, still camped outside the city, polished their muskets and prayed. "This is God's work," they said, but even their voices held doubt. The Rump Parliament set to work. They abolished the monarchy with a stroke of the pen, declared England a Commonwealth, and set about making laws. But governing was harder than winning a war. The treasury was empty, drained by years of fighting. Ireland was in revolt. Catholics there, horrified by the king's death, rallied around his son, Charles II, and drove Protestant settlers from their lands. Scotland, too, refused to recognize the Republic, crowning Charles II as their own king. Oliver Cromwell, the man who had led the army to victory, was now the Republic's strongest hand. In August 1649, he sailed for Ireland, determined to crush the rebellion. His soldiers marched through the country, burning villages and laying siege to towns. At Drogheda, when the garrison refused to surrender, Cromwell's men stormed the walls and killed everyone: soldiers, priests, even women and children. "God is punishing these Catholics for their sins," Cromwell wrote in a letter home, but many in England shuddered. Was this the godly rule they had fought for? By 1650, Ireland was subdued, but Scotland remained a threat. Charles II, a young man with his father's stubbornness but none of his pride, led a Scottish army into England, hoping to reclaim his throne. Cromwell met them at Dunbar, in September 1650, and routed them. "The Lord hath done great things for us," he shouted as Scottish soldiers fled. A year later, at Worcester, he finished the job, chasing Charles II into exile in France. With enemies abroad defeated, Cromwell turned his attention to the Rump Parliament. For years, they had dithered, arguing over taxes and religion, never getting anything done. "You have sat too long for any good you have been doing," Cromwell roared, storming into the Commons' chamber in April 1653. "In the name of God, go!" His soldiers dragged MPs from their seats, and the rump was dissolved. What came next was a grand experiment, a barebones parliament, made up of 140 men chosen for their piety, not their wealth. They tried to abolish tithes, simplify laws, and make England a truly godly nation. But they quarreled endlessly, and after 6 months, they handed power back to Cromwell. "You rule," they said, exhausted. So, in December 1653, Oliver Cromwell became Lord Protector of England, Scotland, and Ireland. He was not a king, but in all but name, he held the same power. He ruled with a council, called parliaments, though he dissolved them when they crossed him, and tried to bring order to the chaos. Life under the Protectorate was a mix of discipline and discontent. Cromwell wanted England to be a virtuous nation. He closed alehouses, banned plays, and fined people for swearing or working on Sundays. "Godliness is next to godliness," he said, but many resented the meddling. A tailor in York grumbled, "First they take our king, then they take our fun." Religion was a minefield. Cromwell was a Puritan, but he believed in liberty of conscience, so long as you were Protestant. Anglicans and Presbyterians could worship, but Catholics were still hounded, and Quakers, with their strange ways, were whipped or jailed. "We fight for freedom," a Quaker woman said as she was led to the stocks, "but not for everyone." Abroad, Cromwell made England feared. His navy defeated the Dutch, seized Jamaica from Spain, and helped France fight the Catholic Habsburgs. "England is a power to be reckoned with," diplomats said, and for the first time, it was true. But all this glory cost money, and taxes rose higher than ever. Farmers in Norfolk shook their fists at tax collectors. "This is worse than the king." By 1657, Cromwell was weary. Parliament offered him the crown, but he refused. "I am not a king," he said, though he lived like one, in palaces with servants and splendor. His health failed, and he grew paranoid, seeing plots everywhere. "The Lord is my strength," he prayed, but his hands shook as he held his Bible. On September 3, 1658, the anniversary of his great victories at Dunbar and Worcester, Oliver Cromwell died. The nation mourned, but not all. A royalist poet wrote, "The tyrant is dead, let's dance." His son, Richard, took his place as Lord Protector, but he was no Cromwell, weak, indecisive, unable to control the army. Here is the question that haunted the Republic: could a nation built on revolution ever find stability? The Commonwealth had dreamed of a government of the people, by the people, but it had become a military dictatorship. Cromwell, the man who had hated tyranny, had become a tyrant in all but name. The ideals of 1642, liberty, justice, equality, were fading, buried under taxes, Puritan rules, and the weight of a nation that missed its king. As 1658 turned to 1659, England teetered. The army argued with Richard Cromwell, then forced him to resign. The Rump Parliament was recalled, then dissolved again. Generals plotted, politicians schemed, and ordinary people prayed for peace. "We tried to be free," a blacksmith said, hammering iron, "but maybe we weren't ready." The Republic, born in blood and hope, was dying. And in its ashes, a familiar figure loomed, Charles II, waiting in France, biding his time. The dream of a kingless England was fading, and no one knew if that was a tragedy, or a mercy. The year 1659 descended on England like a grey fog, thick with confusion and weariness. Richard Cromwell, the son of the great Protector, had fled London in May, abandoning the title that had sat so uneasily on his shoulders. The army, once a unifying force, now splintered into factions, each general claiming to speak for true liberty. The Rump Parliament, recalled and dissolved more times than anyone could count, met in Westminster Hall to argue while the country slid toward anarchy. In taverns, men no longer debated kings or parliaments, they talked of bread prices and bandits. A farmer from Kent, whose crops had been stolen by roaming soldiers, summed it up: "We got rid of one tyrant, and now we've got 100. A weaver in Norwich nodded, mending a torn cloak: "At least the king kept the peace. This is worse than war." Into this chaos stepped George Monk, a stoic general who had spent years governing Scotland with quiet efficiency. In January 1660, he led his army south from Edinburgh, not as a conqueror, but as a peacemaker. His soldiers marched in neat ranks, their boots thudding in unison on the frozen roads. Villagers lined the wayside, staring. "What does he want?" a child asked. His mother shook her head. "Maybe he wants to fix things." Monk's arrival in London in February 1660 changed everything. He didn't seize power or declare himself ruler. Instead, he called for new elections, for a parliament that would speak for the whole nation. Candidates from every faction stood: royalists who had hidden for years, Presbyterians who feared Puritan excess, even some former parliamentarians who admitted the Republic had failed. When the results came in, the new Convention Parliament was filled with men who remembered the old order, and missed it. Their first act? To reach out to the man who had been waiting across the English Channel for years, Charles Stuart, son of the beheaded king, now living in exile in France. Charles was 30 years old, a man who had learned patience the hard way. He had watched his father die, fled from Scotland to France, and survived on the charity of foreign kings. When messengers from London arrived, offering him the throne, he didn't leap at it. He remembered his father's stubbornness, and how it had cost him his head. "What will you give me?" he asked. "And what will you ask in return?" The answer came in the Declaration of Breda, a document Charles issued in April 1660. He promised amnesty to all who had fought against his father, except those directly responsible for the regicide. He vowed to respect Parliament's power over taxes and laws. He even offered limited religious freedom, saying men should enjoy the quiet of their own consciences. It was a masterpiece of compromise, and England sighed with relief. On May 8, 1660, the Convention Parliament voted to restore the monarchy. "God save King Charles II, they shouted, and the cry echoed through London. Bells rang, bonfires blazed, and people danced in the streets. A tailor in Cheapside hung a sign: "The King is back, let's sew up the past." Charles landed in Dover on May 25, 1660, to a welcome fit for a hero. Crowds knelt as his carriage passed, women threw flowers, children cheered until their throats were hoarse. He smiled and waved, a charm he had honed in exile, and whispered to a friend, "I never thought they'd miss me so much." As he rode toward London, villages turned out to greet him. A farmer presented him with a basket of apples, a vicar prayed for his reign. At Canterbury, the archbishop placed a crown on his head, not the ancient crown of England, which had been melted down during the Republic, but a new one, shining bright. "Welcome home, sire," the archbishop said. Charles nodded. "It's good to be home." Not everyone rejoiced. Some Puritans locked their doors, fearing persecution. Soldiers of the new model army, now disbanded, muttered about betrayal. "We fought for liberty," one said, "and got a king." But even they had to admit, the streets were safer, the markets busier, and for the first time in years, no one was talking about war. Here is a question that hung in the air like spring rain: why did England turn back to a king? Because revolutions are exhausting. The Republic had promised freedom, but delivered chaos. Cromwell's rule had brought order, but with it Puritan strictness and high taxes. People missed the familiar, the pageantry of monarchy, the stability of a crown that didn't change with every argument in Parliament. They wanted to believe that some things could be mended, not just replaced. Charles II entered London on May 29, 1660, his 30th birthday. The city was decked in flags, fountains flowed with wine. As he passed through the gates of Whitehall, where his father had died, he paused. For a moment, his smile faded. Then he walked on, into the palace, into the future. The revolution was over. Or was it? The year 1660 marked the return of kings to England, but the shadow of revolution lingered like mist over a meadow, soft, yet impossible to ignore. Charles II sat on his father's throne, and the rituals of monarchy unfolded once more: coronations with golden crowns, feasts where wine flowed from fountains, lords in velvet bowing low. But beneath the pageantry, something fundamental had shifted. The country that had beheaded a king, then welcomed his son back, was not the same as the one that had watched Elizabeth I die. It was a nation that had learned to question, to negotiate, to hold power accountable, even if it still stumbled over the lesson. Parliament, once a tool of royal will, now stood as a counterweight. When Charles II asked for funds to fight the Dutch, MPs did not simply hand over gold. They demanded audits, debated strategy, and tied his hands with conditions. "We remember what happens when kings spend freely," a merchant-turned-MP said, tapping his ledger. It was not rebellion, but caution, a habit forged in the fires of war. The old idea that kings ruled by divine right had cracked. In its place grew a new truth: kings ruled with the consent of the governed, and that consent could be withdrawn. Religion, too, bore the scars and blessings of upheaval. The Church of England was restored, its bishops back in their cathedrals, its prayer books read aloud in villages. But Puritans, though barred from official posts, met in barns and private homes, their hymns mixing with the rustle of wheat. Quakers, with their plain speech and refusal to bow, walked the streets without fear of the stocks. Catholics, still marginalized, worshipped in secret, but the days of mass executions were gone. "We cannot force souls to bend," a bishop admitted, after a parishioner asked why he did not prosecute a neighbor for attending a Puritan meeting. Tolerance was not universal, but it was wider than before, a fragile flower, planted in the soil of suffering. The economy, shattered by war, sprouted new life. Merchants in London traded with the East Indies, their ships protected by a navy built during the Commonwealth. Banks lent money to farmers and artisans, turning small dreams into thriving businesses. Even ordinary folk felt the shift. A blacksmith in Lancashire, who once rented his forge, now owned it. A weaver's wife in Essex, who once could not read, kept her husband's accounts. "We're not lords," the blacksmith said, wiping sweat from his brow, "but we're not serfs either." That's the revolution's doing. Women, who had managed estates and defended towns while men fought, did not retreat quietly. A shopkeeper's wife in Bristol negotiated prices with suppliers. A farmer's daughter in Kent wrote letters to her brother in America, debating politics. They still faced limits: no voting, no seats in Parliament, but the idea that their voices did not matter had been shaken. "We kept the world turning when it was falling apart," a midwife said, as she helped a mother deliver her child. "They can't pretend we don't exist, not anymore." Across the Atlantic, the Revolution's ideas took root in colonies like Massachusetts and Virginia. Settlers, many of them Puritans or former parliamentarians, talked of no taxation without representation and government by consent, phrases born in the debates of the Long Parliament. One day, these ideas would ignite another revolution, as they fought to break free from the very crown their ancestors had challenged. In England itself, the lessons of the 1640s and 1650s shaped the future in ways no one could have predicted. When Charles II died, his brother James II tried to restore absolute rule, but Parliament and the people would not allow it. In 1688, they invited William of Orange and Mary to take the throne, but only after they signed the Bill of Rights, a document that enshrined Parliament's power, banned cruel punishment, and guaranteed free elections. It was not the Republic of Cromwell's dreams, but a monarchy bound by law, a constitutional monarchy, where the crown ruled with Parliament, not over it. The men who fought and died, Oliver Cromwell's soldiers, the farmers at Edgehill, the women who lost sons and husbands, did not live to see this balance. Their graves are unmarked, their names forgotten by most. But their courage echoes in every election, every debate, every time a citizen says, "This is my country, too." Revolution, it turns out, is not a single event. It is a process, a slow, messy unfolding of what it means to be free. England did not become a perfect nation, but it became a better one, more fair, more open, more willing to grow. The dynasty returned, but it returned to a country that would never again bow blindly to kings. As night falls, and the stars light up the sky over fields once soaked in blood, we can honor those who came before by remembering, their fight was not in vain. They taught us that change is possible, even when it is painful, that freedom is not given, but earned, that the work of making a nation just is never finished. So rest easy, knowing that the revolution's story is not over. It lives in us, in the way we stand up for what is right, in the way we listen to those who are different, in the hope that tomorrow can be better than today. Good night, and sweet dreams, of a world still learning, still growing, still reaching for the light.